I think we've covered the recruiting class perfectly.
Alrighty, then we're gonna head into game cancellations for our second segment. Now this for the Pac-12 hopefully is not a when, but an if. However, looking around the nation, I think you and I both agree it's an if. It's not an if, but a
Yeah.
when.
I mean, we're looking at it. So there's been 7 weeks of college football so far, and there's been 34 games that have either been postponed or canceled. I know Baylor's had at least 2 games that have been postponed or canceled, and they can only make up one of those. So one of
Yeah.
them's canceled for sure. And you're looking at this as it's tough, especially for Pac-12 with them having this small amount of time to play. They only have 7 weeks available to them. The SEC had built in like an extra week for this exact scenario. So Florida and LSU had to get their game postponed, but SEC built in a week for them to play that because they had the time.
Yeah.
Unlike us, who November 7th, I think, is week one, and then we go all the way up till the weekend that the College Football Playoff Committee decides. So there's no time for postponed games. If the game doesn't get played, it's going to get canceled. And
Yeah.
looking at it from the Pac 12, however, knows this. So they're doing different testing than these other schools. The SEC, Big 12, and Conference USA, their COVID testing policies are at least 3 tests per week only. So these schools are only doing 3 tests per week. Pac 12 has already come out and say that they're going to be testing their players whenever they step on the field. That's going to be Monday through Saturday. There's going to be a test, and they're hoping that that cuts down on the transmission of the disease as they'll be able to quickly isolate the player and then do other testing to make sure players who are in contact with them don't have it. So that's one thing the Pac 12 has going for them. But even with that, I mean, you look at it, the NFL, that's what they're doing, right? And they haven't had the same amount as college football, but there have been games that have been postponed
Yep.
or pushed to a different day of the week and had to reorganize the whole schedule. So as you said before, it's not really an if, it's a when these games get postponed,
Yeah,
canceled.
absolutely. It's definitely a when is it going to happen and how is that going to play out. With the foresight, I feel like for the Pac-12 having that later start, I mean much later start compared to other leagues, which I'm not upset about. Like I'm not upset that we started later. But I'm sure for the Pac-12 CEO group, a lot of this decision came down to the fact that they were probably thinking, hey, look, we're starting later. We've been able to watch all of these other leagues and conferences start up. We've seen how they've handled the situation. And I really hope that this was one of their reasonings behind this and working around this late 7 game schedule was that they looked at it and they said, okay, we have a smaller season, but what we're going to do is we're going to just set the bar super high. We're going to have daily testing for practices and games. And one great thing that I don't think you mentioned with that is that when you test every day, the ability to contact trace and figure out where that infection came from, where it's spreading, if it spread, and being able to trace that back is so easy when you're testing every day. Like it's almost impossible for it to go into the radar. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's nearly impossible for that to go into the radar when you have testing that often. And also just knowing like how well off at least UW is in terms of medical facilities and medical personnel and medical training. I mean, UW's just known for that. Having that in our back pocket as well, I think at least I think sets us up very well for this season if we were to see infections come. Another big reason for this that I'm not really worried about, at least with the Pac-12, and we'll be talking more about it in the next segment, is that we're going to be having empty stadiums until January. So that won't ever be a worry for COVID. One thing that does worry me a little bit about the whole COVID situation with games possibly getting canceled is simply that everyone who tests positive, there's no set timeline for how long you have to quarantine. Yes, there's one if you're in their words, if you've been exposed to some form of, and I quote, high risk contacts. That means you've definitely crossed paths with them at the same time in the same room. It was maybe someone inside of your skills team or your group on the practice field. Those are definitely high risk contacts. They just need the 2 week quarantine period and they can come back. The problem, though, and like you said, we've seen it in the NFL with these teams. I mean, these guys are playing for their livelihoods and their jobs, so that's how seriously they're taking their COVID health things. These are college athletes, many of whom maybe not that serious about the sport yet. And so what's worrying is that if you do test positive, the time that it takes for COVID to run its course through your body can be anywhere from 7 days up to and past 6 weeks. So
Yeah.
it gets, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, you keep continuing.
So that gets scary, especially when you think that the Pac-12 only has a 7-week schedule. Like, let's say 1, 2, maybe 5 people in the Pac-12 in total get it. Like, that's just a scary fact of the matter is that those 5 college students, I mean, these are very young people in the grand scheme of things. Those guys are out for their entire season, possibly. And so being very, very, very careful ahead of time. Game cancellations, I think, fall into being careful ahead of time. All of that pre-planning, pre-recognition, and making sure things don't escalate is where a lot of this is going to come down to, and why I think game cancellations are going to end up happening.
I